It's all yours.
I've got a tremendous amount out of this conference, and it's very interesting because I didn't know the medical side. But I think conscience has very direct, the concept of conscience has very direct implications. Now, looking at the history of the idea of conscience, which started being analysed by the Greeks, I see that it started off in the first 600 years as meaning a belief that what you had done or what you might do would be wrong. That was the basic idea. There was absolutely nothing in those first 100 years about an inner voice, let alone God's inner voice, including St. Paul, nowhere there. At first, God didn't even have a role at all in the 6th and 5th centuries in the Greek accounts of conscience. Soon God began to get various roles, but certainly not that of an inner voice. The inner voice came from a very unexpected direction after the first 600 years. It came from Platonists who liked Plato's account of Socrates as having a demigod with a voice. This demigod would warn Socrates not to do various things, not always moral things. Sometimes it was whether to stay where he was or to leave. But this was the first time when something, not actually a god, but a demigod, was described as a voice, an inner voice, and eventually that may have influenced Christians, but I haven't found it in Christianity up to the 6th century AD, when the second Platonist did it. The first Platonist was about 2nd century AD, the second Platonist was about 6th century AD. It came from Socrates. The equation of Socrates' demigod's voice with conscience. It was not mainstream at all. Now, the second point about conscience is that the idea that a bad conscience split you in two was there at the very beginning, but in a way which I think almost nobody had understood. I found it understood by one person. I did eventually find two other people who'd understood it. It was all to do with the meaning of the word con. Most people have thought that it meant this was something shared, con in Latin meaning shared. Conscience was always based on some shared view. It isn't even true. Sometimes conscience take a very unusual direction. But that wasn't the meaning of shared. I won't explain the real meaning. If I'd had 20 minutes, I would. I won't in 10 minutes. Another thing about conscience is that it was declared fallible. And that was the standard Christian view. It was the view of the first Christian writer about conscience, St. Paul, that his conscience was fallible, the Corinthians' conscience was fallible. It's very much discussed by Thomas Aquinas. It seems to be a widely agreed principle that conscience is infallible in Christianity. It is not infallible, it's fallible. It's also widely agreed in Christianity that conscience is not the source of moral knowledge. It's not the source of moral knowledge. It is the application of your moral knowledge to the particular case. That is so in the 500 years of the Greeks. That is so in St. Paul. That is so in Thomas Aquinas. That is so very much throughout. It seems to be, I don't say that in 2,500 years there are no deviations, and deviations may be all right if they don't cause confusion, but that is very regularly the case. It's about the particular application of your knowledge, it's not the source of knowledge. Now my third point. Although bad a conscience was said to split your integrity, at the very, very beginning, in the very meaning of the word, the Greek version of con, which is sion, sounds a bit similar, but the very word sion implied a split. Nonetheless, that is not a good reason for not violating people's consciences. the fact that it splits their feeling of integrity. Because this is very variable among different people. Some people's integrity is very easily split. Some people's integrity is rather hard to split. It's more water off a duck's back. So it's very variable. And so you shouldn't treat people, avoid treating people's conscience according to whether their integrity is very much split, because then you'll be treating them very variably. And exactly the same is true about the strength of their feeling. Both their strength of their feeling at the time before they do the act they're unwilling to do, and how badly they would feel afterwards. This also is extremely variable. It depends on all sorts of things. Some people react to having done what they feel is wrong by thinking, well, I make amends somehow. Other people think they're damned forever. It's extremely variable. That does not form the reason, or should not form the reason, why we are reluctant to make people violate their conscience. I think it's impossible, or I haven't succeeded in finding a better reason than saying the reason why it's not a good thing, if you can avoid it, to force people to go against their conscience is because that's forcing them to do what they think is wrong by the very original definition of the term. If that isn't clear to you, it's not helpful to go to a side effect of them feeling wrong, like they'll feel very bad, or they will to some extent be split, perhaps a large extent, perhaps a small extent. These are side effects of them thinking it wrong. The centerpiece is that they think it wrong. That should be clear enough. That's the reason why, not that you should never violate their conscience, but you should hesitate to violate their conscience. Now, some of the very interesting examples we've had were presented in a way in which you might think that in many of our cases we had conscience on one side and some other moral judgment on the other. There were some very rare cases in our 2 days of discussion where conscience wasn't relevant, and conscience is not always going to be relevant to these medical decisions, not always. But in many of the cases discussed, it seemed to me that conscience, in what I regard as the core sense of conscience, the belief that something was morally wrong for you to do, was in play on both sides. If we take the very interesting examples given by Dominic about conscientious non-objection, bringing yourself not to object to switching off the life support. Well, I think there's conscience on both sides, in my sense of conscience, which is the most useful one, I think. Because variants like God's voice, when they're brought in, who knows which side God's on? He might take either side, but none of us actually knows. Whereas in the original sense of conscience, original for centuries, and very, very influential right up to today, there was conscience on both sides in that example, and similarly in the example that we were given by Alberto of not wanting to send a patient back to the refugee camp, but also not wanting to block beds by refusing to admit people who needed treatment next. Well, conscience was on both sides, in the core sense of conscience. As for God's voice, who knows which side God was on? It's best, that's not a very helpful concept of conscience. And there was one more example. I think Hugh La Follette was talking about how, in his view, we should usually override our conscience, but the reasons that he gave why we might be advised to override our conscience brought in conscience on the other side. I think in most of our cases, it was conscience versus conscience. If you take what I regard as having been the core view of conscience, of course there are variations, some of them I think very unhelpful, leading to dogmatism in the case of people who think they're hearing the voice of God. And I'm nearly there because it's just one more point. These cases I've just mentioned, which were so interestingly brought up in our discussions, where, in my view, conscience is on both sides, these cases show it's perfectly possible for you to be wrong whichever way you go. Now that's a very important finding, which was extremely obvious to the Greeks. The famous example on the cover of my book, actually. Orestes. Greek molarity put him in a very difficult position. His mother had murdered his father. So Greek morality required him to avenge his father. He was obliged. Avenge his father by murdering his mother. Both were absolutely wrong. The Greeks understood that. They had no hesitation. They tell it fascinatingly. The Christians didn't want to acknowledge that. And Pope Gregory the Great, who's a very great thinker, but an early one, what was he, 7th century? I probably got that wrong. But early. He tried to say, yes, there are these cases where you're wrong whichever way you go, but it's always your fault that you got into that situation. Is it? Well, he gives 3 rather telling and amusing examples in which it was your fault you got into a situation where now whatever you did was wrong. But by the 12th century, 13th century, with some of the greatest Christian thinkers of all, Abelard, Bonaventure, most of all Thomas Aquinas, it was perfectly clear to them that you were sometimes in a position where whichever way you acted, you were doing wrong, and there was no avoiding it. It wasn't your fault. Cases Thomas Aquinas brought up of erroneous conscience, because he's in the tradition, the standard tradition, where your conscience may be wrong. If your conscience is in error through no fault of yours, through no negligence, or anything of that kind, then you may get into the situation where whatever you do is wrong. We've had these situations coming up and again in our 2 weeks. So it's not conscience just on one side. The person whom I mentioned, I think, in discussion, and I find an absolutely wonderful philosopher and moralist, Mahatma Gandhi, was terribly good about this, even on his favourite subject of non-violence. He celebrated, I will end with this story, he congratulated the municipal council for shooting 60 dogs that might be rabid because they were stray. Hindus wrote to Gandhi from all over India, absolutely horrified. We thought you believed in non-violence. And he had to think through a series of 7 articles, which are very hard to get hold of, they're not intellectual works. And his thought, I think, was absolutely brilliant. He decided that violence was always wrong, unless it was for the sake of the kill, as with euthanasia. Violence against sentient beings, always wrong. So wasn't he up the creek? Because he'd just been congratulating people for exercising violence. He said, look here, these general principles, like violence is always wrong, that's absolutely true, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how to act, because something else may be even more wrong. Now suppose that you have undertaken to sit on the municipal council, then you have taken a vow, and you've made yourself responsible for the safety of the citizens. That doesn't apply to other people who haven't served on the municipal council and aren't going to. Not to an ordinary householder, but if you serve on the municipal council, then you've undertaken an overriding obligation to protect the municipality from rabies, among many other things. So now, although you're in the wrong for killing a sentient being, which is absolutely wrong, it will be even worse if after your undertaking you don't protect the public from rabies. So he was very good on this situation of how we're often in a morally impossible situation where whatever we do is wrong, but one thing is clearly much wronger than the other. So he's a subtle philosopher. This was something the Stoics were very good at too. The Christians much more hesitant, but they did in the end recognize it. So.
Okay, thank you.